September 1944. The wind rolled across the English airfields, carrying the smell of oil, damp grass, and cigarette smoke. Rows of C-47 Dakotas waited in the mist, their fuselages painted with black and white invasion stripes, wings heavy with gliders tethered behind them like silent beasts. Men walked among them, helmets hanging loose, parachutes slung over their shoulders, faces pale under the sodium lamps. Some laughed too loudly. Others stared at nothing. On the flight line at RAF Fairford, a British officer named Major Richard Lonsdale finished a letter he would never send. He wrote, "If this works, the war could be over by Christmas. If not, God help the men on those bridges." He folded the page, sealed it, and tucked it into his breast pocket. Inside the briefing tent, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and adrenaline. A wall map stretched across the front, red and blue pins marking rivers and towns: Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem. General Montgomery stood in front of it, pointer in hand, the rhythm of his voice clipped and certain. "We strike here," he said, tapping the map with the tip of his stick. 3 airborne divisions, 1 American, 1 British, 1 Polish. They dropped behind enemy lines and seized the bridges. The ground forces pushed through from the south. 1 road, 1 thrust, straight into Germany. "If we hold those bridges, gentlemen, the war ends in weeks." Silence followed, the kind that carries both awe and unease. An American officer muttered under his breath, "Looks beautiful on paper. Too beautiful." Eisenhower's command had promised a quick end to the war, one last gamble to pierce the Reich's heart through the Netherlands. The Allies were exhausted but hungry for closure. After Normandy, after the hedgerows, after months of mud and blood, they wanted one clean stroke to finish it. Market garden, they called it. Market for the airborne assault, garden for the armored advance that would follow. The plan was daring. It was also fragile. 35,000 men would drop from the sky in a single day, the largest airborne operation in history. The paratroopers would land up to 60 miles behind enemy lines, far from resupply or reinforcement. Success depended on one narrow road, the only path that linked them to the British tanks that were supposed to rescue them. If that road failed, so would everything. Still, the room buzzed with confidence. Montgomery smiled as he said, "Gentlemen, this will be the 100-mile thunderbolt. Once we're across the Rhine, Berlin is ours." He closed his folder, snapped it shut like a verdict, and walked out into the fog. Outside, engines coughed to life. Mechanics checked propellers with frozen fingers. Men stood in line for final inspections: bolts, harnesses, ammunition, morphine, Lucky Charms. One soldier taped a photo of his wife to his helmet. Another rubbed a silver coin until it gleamed. The chaplain moved through the ranks, murmuring blessings no one really heard. At 2300 hours, the order came: load up. The first wave of paratroopers climbed into their aircraft. Inside the C-47s it smelled of fuel, canvas, and fear. The flight sergeant shouted over the engines, "Next stop, Holland." The men cheered, but the sound was thin. Up front, the pilots checked their watches. Takeoff, 6 o'clock. Drop time, 10 o'clock. The operation would stretch from the Belgian border to the Rhine, a corridor of sky filled with wings. In the officer's tent, Major Lonsdale stood over the map one last time. His second-in-command, Captain Wiersma, a Dutchman who had fled after the occupation, stared at the red line cutting through his homeland. "It's a long way to Arnhem," he said quietly. Lonsdale replied, "Longer if the weather turns." Wiersma nodded. "And if the Germans are waiting?" Lonsdale forced a grin. "Then we'll give them a proper welcome." But later, when the lights went out, even the bravest men lay awake listening to the wind scrape across the hangars. The RAF weather report predicted low clouds over the channel, and rumors said German armor had been spotted near Arnhem. Officially, intelligence dismissed it: scattered units, no major threat. Unofficially, no one believed that. Just after midnight, the aircrews received their final signal sheets. A code word was printed in block letters at the top: Ladybird, the confirmation to launch. The mission was on. At 4 o'clock, the first engine started, the sound rolling across the airfield like thunder. Crews strapped in. Gliders were secured behind the Dakotas. The sky was still black, but a thin rim of dawn pressed against the horizon. Pilots exchanged brief nods with the men in the back, an unspoken contract of faith. A private named Harris, 19 years old, turned to the man beside him and asked, "You think we'll be home by Christmas?" The sergeant didn't answer. He just adjusted the kid's chin strap and said, "Keep your eyes open on the way down. It's beautiful till the shooting starts." When the sun rose, the fog burned off. The airfield shimmered with light and motion. Thousands of planes lined up on the runways, silver wings catching the morning sun. One after another, they began to roll, lifting into the air, pulling their gliders behind them like kites. From the ground, it looked like the sky itself was coming apart. For the men inside, it felt like the beginning of the end. And at dawn, the horizon filled with planes. And with them, the first step toward a bridge too far. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. At 10 a.m., the people of Eindhoven looked up, and the sky wasn't blue anymore. It was white, a blizzard of parachutes drifting down through the sunlight. For a moment, it looked like snow. Then the engines roared overhead, and the sound rolled across the fields like thunder. Old men came out of barns. Children ran into the streets, waving torn Dutch flags they had hidden for years. Some cried, some prayed, some just stared. After 4 years of German occupation, freedom was falling from the sky. From above, the view was breathtaking and terrible. Rows of C-47s stretched as far as the eye could see, more than 2,000 aircraft. The air vibrated with the noise of engines, wind, and static crackling through headsets. In the back of one plane, a young paratrooper from the 101st Airborne kissed a tiny wooden cross around his neck. The jumpmaster shouted over the din, "Stand up! Hook up!" Boots scraped metal. Parachute cords snapped taut. Then go! Men leapt into sunlight and chaos. The wind tore at their faces. Silk canopies bloomed open like white flowers against the sky. Below them, fields of green and gold rushed up fast, too fast. Some hit hard and rolled. Others were dragged by gusts across ditches. One man landed in a tree, laughing until he saw the tracer fire cutting through the air. The first hour of the invasion was confusion disguised as triumph. Paratroopers landed miles off target, some in flooded fields, others in pockets of German resistance. A few gliders crashed on impact, wings snapping like matchsticks. From the ruins, medics crawled out and went straight to work. But the Dutch civilians didn't see the chaos, only the miracle. They ran toward the paratroopers, shouting, "Welcome! Welcome!" A woman handed out apples. Another pressed flowers into a soldier's hands, weeping. The men smiled but kept their rifles ready. War, they knew, never stayed beautiful for long. By noon, Eindhoven was alive with noise. Allied jeeps rumbling through narrow streets, locals cheering from rooftops, church bells ringing for the first time in years. An American sergeant stopped to light a cigarette for an old man, who whispered, "We thought you'd never come." Across the countryside, however, the reality was harsher. Bridges were missing, rivers were mined, and the enemy, far from retreating, was regrouping. Near sun, a detachment from the 101st reached their objective only to see the bridge explode before their eyes. The blast threw dirt and metal into the air. Pieces of wood rained down like confetti from hell. "We crossed too late," one soldier muttered. "The bastards blew it in our faces." Further north, the 82nd Airborne fought for the bridges at Grave and Nijmegen. German flak tore through the sky, punching holes in parachutes. Some men never even reached the ground alive. Those who did landed firing. The fight for every village, every street corner, was close and brutal. Rifles, grenades, and bayonets flashing in the smoke. Meanwhile, 80 miles away, the British 1st Airborne Division was descending over the outskirts of Arnhem. It should have been an easy landing. It wasn't. High winds scattered the gliders across the countryside, many breaking apart on impact. In one field, a jeep burned like a torch. In another, paratroopers dug into the dirt as machine gun fire swept across them. The radios crackled, then went silent. Captain John Frost, leading his men toward the Arnhem Bridge, realized the scale of the problem. "We're on our own," he told his second. "Let's make it count." By evening, the sun was low and red over the Dutch flatlands. Columns of smoke rose where supply drops had missed and set barns ablaze. The road network was clogged with confusion, convoys of paratroopers marching one way, wounded being carried the other. Civilians waved flags, handed out bread, shouted blessings, and then hit again when the artillery started. In London, reports came through, market phase successful. All bridges secured except Arnhem. On paper, it looked like victory. In reality, it was anything but. The airborne divisions were stretched thin, scattered, and already low on ammunition. And the ground forces that were supposed to reach them, the tanks of XXX Corps, were crawling north far too slowly. In the shattered town squares of Sun and Nijmegen, soldiers built makeshift defenses out of furniture and sandbags. They could hear German mortars echoing from the forests. "They're not running," one lieutenant said grimly. "They're coming back." Over Arnhem, the last gliders descended in flames. Frost's men reached the bridge at dusk, exhausted, cut off, and unaware that 2 full SS Panzer divisions were massing less than 10 miles away. From the air, the scene looked almost serene. Hundreds of parachutes lying across the fields like fallen petals, the rivers glinting in the sunset. But on the ground, the roads were burning, and the first screams of artillery filled the night. The Dutch who had cheered that morning now watched from their windows, realizing the front was not moving forward. It was coming back toward them. The sky that had promised liberation now glowed orange with fire. And in the distance, toward Arnhem, the sound of engines grew louder, German engines. The bridges were still standing, but the men holding them were already running out of time. They called it Hell's Highway, a single strip of tarmac 30 miles long, raised over swamp and dike. The only road to Arnhem. If it held, the war could end. If it broke, everything would. At first light, the tanks of XXX Corps rolled north, Cromwell's, Sherman's, Bren carriers in endless lines. The air stank of exhaust and wet earth. Civilians waved flags, pressed apples into soldiers' hands, shouting, "Go! Go! Arnhem waits!" The men smiled, until the first shell hit. A German 88 cracked from the trees. The lead tank exploded, tracks thrown. Bullets cut the verges. Ambush left. Someone yelled, though no one could see the shooters. Only smoke drifting through willows. Infantry dove into a drainage ditch. Sappers crawled forward, clearing mines under fire. On the radio, road obstructed. Stand by. They were trapped. One-lane road. No cover, no way to turn. A voice came over the net. Tigers on our right. Through the mist, dark shapes moved. Their first round punched through a Sherman like paper. The crew didn't climb out. British artillery answered. Smoke rolled in, thick as fog. Under it, engineers worked, measuring, hammering, laying a temporary bridge while bullets hissed overhead. "We build here," the sergeant said. Men smoked and watched the seconds tick by. By noon, they had advanced 5 miles. The plan called for 15. Reports came. Sun Bridge gone. Vegel cut by German paratroopers. Supply convoys piled up for miles. Fuel trucks, ambulances, ammo lorries. One shell in that queue, and the whole road would burn. A colonel stood on a jeep bonnet, binoculars in hand. "Push, damn it." A tired voice replied. "We can't move north. The paratroopers are on their own." Further ahead, at Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne fought street by street. Civilians rang church bells, warnings, prayers, maybe courage. Radio fragments bled together. Tank hit. Need medics. Sniper in the mill. Hold the bridge. Every mile cost hours. Every field a life. Rain came hard, turning mud to grease. A recovery team tried to move a wrecked tank. The cable snapped, slicing through the air. The driver sat motionless inside, hands on cold levers. A chaplain climbed up, whispering a prayer through the storm. Still, the Dutch helped. Women hauled tea to the roadside. Boys pointed out enemy nests they'd watched for years. When mortars fell, they vanished. When silence returned, they came back. Liberation was no parade. It was work. At dusk, sappers finished a Bailey Bridge at Sun. Hammers rang. Engines roared as the first tank crossed. "Go on, love," a soldier shouted, slapping the armor. Arnhem's waiting. But the night brought no rest. Germans cut the road again near Uden. A bakery became a fort, a dike path, a battlefield. Ambulances crawled south, blue lights covered, carrying silence. In a barn used as HQ, an officer traced the map. "If we reach Nijmegen by dawn, Arnhem tomorrow." His aide shook his head. "Sir, for them, Arnhem is already tonight." A dispatch rider arrived, soaked to the bone. The message was short, radio silence from 1st Airborne. Enemy armor near Arnhem. Bridge held, strength unknown. Outside, engines idled in the dark. The column had stopped again. Somewhere ahead, a Tiger found its range. Each shot echoed down the highway like a heartbeat slowing. They had come 5 miles. Arnhem was 30 beyond the river. And in that distant city, the Red Devils still held the bridge, surrounded, waiting. At first light, they saw the bridge. Steel, silent, perfect, and surrounded by German armor. The mist lifted off the Rhine like breath from a sleeping giant. The men of the 1st Airborne, barely 700 now, crouched in the ruins along the northern ramp of the Arnhem Bridge. They hadn't slept in 2 days. Helmets were dented, uniforms stiff with dirt and blood. The smell of cordite and burned wood hung in the air. Colonel John Frost, standing in what had once been a cafe, peered through a shattered window with his field glasses. The bridge stretched away in a clean, deadly line, his prize and his prison. To the south, he could see the smoke of tank exhaust curling in the cold air. "They'll come again," someone said behind him. Frost nodded. "Then we'll greet them properly." He gave the order he'd been repeating since the first landing. Hold until relieved. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. The relief wasn't coming. Radios crackled with static, messages half heard and half lost. The promised tanks were still miles away, trapped somewhere on Hell's Highway. At 7 a.m., the first German assault began. Tigers rolled out of the fog, their turrets turning like slow predators. British PIT teams waited in doorways and trenches, hearts pounding. A corporal whispered, "Wait till you see the whites of their eyes, or whatever tanks have instead." The first shot hit. Flames leapt from the hull of the lead Tiger. Cheers broke out, short and sharp. Then came the others, 5, 6, more behind them. Shells tore through the buildings, blowing bricks into the air like paper. Men ducked under tables, behind door frames, under broken staircases. "They came at us like ghosts in the smoke," a survivor would write later. "We hit one, but there were always more." For the next 48 hours, Arnhem was a war inside a neighborhood. Every house became a fortress, every garden a battlefield. The paratroopers fired until barrels glowed red. Medics worked by candlelight in basements that reeked of blood and damp earth. Outside, the bridge trembled under artillery fire. Windows shattered, cars burned on the ramp. One by one, the paratroopers' positions fell. They pulled back to the northern pier, still clutching the one thing they had come for, the bridge itself. On the second night, the Germans sent a messenger under a white flag. He shouted up the street in broken English, "Surrender now. You are surrounded. We will treat you well." The only answer was silence, and the crack of a single rifle shot that sent him running. By dawn, Frost's force had dwindled to a few dozen. Ammunition ran low. They stripped clips from the dead and counted every bullet. Food was gone. Water came from a gutter running red. When shells stopped, it wasn't peace, just the pause between storms. In a ruined parlor, Frost leaned over a radio that hissed but said nothing. His adjutant asked, "Sir, should we destroy the sets?" "Not yet," Frost said quietly. "Someone might be listening." Outside, the Germans dragged their dead from the road. The smoke was so thick it turned morning into dusk. Frost watched the bridge through the haze. It still stood, his last defiance. A young private beside him, no older than 19, murmured, "Sir, do you think they'll come? The tanks?" Frost didn't answer. He looked across the river instead, toward the flat, gray horizon where rescue should have appeared by now. When the next shell struck, the building folded inward like paper. Frost was thrown clear, ears ringing, leg bleeding. He crawled into a ditch, shouting for his men, half of whom were already gone. By afternoon, the Germans had the upper hand. Snipers fired from rooftops. Flamethrowers cleared the last houses. The paratroopers held on through sheer instinct. "We'll not give them the bridge," one sergeant growled. "Not till they bury us under it." When night came, the sky glowed red, the color of victory or ruin. The bridge stood illuminated by firelight, still defiant, still British. For 4 days, they held against 9,000 Germans. Outnumbered, outgunned, out of time. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a message. The bridge, one survivor wrote later, was no longer a target. It had become a symbol, of courage, of faith, and of how far belief can carry men before it breaks them. Down the road, the rumble of tanks was faint but steady, the reinforcements still crawling north, fighting mile by mile. The men at Arnhem couldn't hear them anymore. And while Frost's battered company fought for the bridge, those reinforcements were still miles away, stuck on a road built for failure. One shell hit the convoy, and everything stopped. The highway to Arnhem was now a graveyard of metal. September 19, 1944. Rain fell in sheets over the Dutch lowlands, turning the narrow road into a mirror of mud and smoke. The tanks of XXX Corps, once roaring with momentum, now sat motionless, turrets silent, engines choking in puddles of oil and ash. The single artery that connected the Allies to Arnhem had been severed. The first explosion hit a fuel truck. Flames surged upward, blackening the sky. Ammunition lorries went next, the blasts rolling down the column like thunder through a canyon. Drivers abandoned their vehicles, running for ditches as machine guns tore into the wreckage. Someone shouted, "Medic! Medic!" But the word vanished into the storm of noise. A sergeant, crouched behind a burned-out half-track, muttered, "The whole bloody war's on this road." He wasn't wrong. The Germans knew it too. From the woods east of Wegel, mortars began to fall, cutting the supply line clean in two. For the men up north, Frost survivors in Arnhem, it meant silence. No fuel, no food, no rescue. Just the sound of rain on steel. To reopen the route, the Americans of the 82nd Airborne were ordered to seize the Great Bridge over the River Vaal at Nijmegen. There was no time to wait for boats. They would have to cross, in daylight, under fire, in open canvas craft. They launched at 3 p.m. The river was wide, gray, and angry. Oars creaked. Bullets punched holes in the water around them. Men paddled with rifle butts when blades snapped. "Keep going," someone yelled, though half the boats were already sinking. One sergeant from New Jersey later said, "We rode straight into hell, and hell shot back." They reached the far bank with barely half their number. Those who survived charged up the embankment, grenades and bayonets ready, faces black with smoke and river mud. Behind them, the engineers dragged the remaining boats for another run. Within an hour, they had stormed the German bunkers and taken the bridge. But time was gone. The sun was setting, the road north still clogged with wrecks, and Arnhem was dying by the minute. When the British tanks finally crossed the Vaal, they were greeted by cheers from the 82nd, and by the bodies of men still floating in the river. One corporal whispered, "They bought us a bridge, but Arnhem's paying the bill." The victory at Nijmegen came at a terrible price. Nearly 200 Americans killed or wounded. Still, the bridge stood intact, another link in the chain that was supposed to lead to Germany. Except the chain had rusted. The Germans regrouped faster than anyone thought possible. Each crossing cost another day, and every day was a death sentence for the paratroopers at Arnhem. On the night of the 20th, the highway lit up again, this time with German counterattacks. Paratroopers and infantry fought through towns that changed hands 3 times in one evening. A truck carrying medical supplies burst into flames. Its driver refused to leave the wheel until it rolled off the road, clearing the way for the tanks behind him. By midnight, the advance had stalled once more. Arnhem was just 11 miles ahead, 11 miles that might as well have been 100. In London, commanders read the reports and tried to make sense of them. Bridge captured, but progress slow. Enemy resistance increasing. Airborne contact lost. The words looked clinical on paper. In reality, it meant hundreds dying for a plan drawn in ink and optimism. The next morning, a single Spitfire flew low over the river, banking toward Arnhem. The pilot reported heavy smoke, fires in the city, and no visible movement on the bridge. "Looks like they're still holding," he said. But he didn't see the truth, that what was left of Frost's men were already trapped under the burning arches. A tanker from the Guards Armored Division later wrote, "We were so close we could hear the guns, but we couldn't reach them. The road just ended." Hell's highway had collapsed. Not just the road, but the dream it carried. By the time the tanks reached the next river, the bridge was still there, but the men who had held it were already gone. We had nothing left, no ammo, no food, no hope. Only the bridge. And the bridge was burning. By September 21st, Arnhem was a carcass of brick and fire. The elegant Dutch houses along the river had been blasted into skeletons. The paratroopers who still held the northern ramp of the bridge, the last 100 or so of Frost's battalion, were ghosts inside those ruins. Faces blackened with soot, eyes red from smoke, voices cracked to whispers. The smell of everything, cordite, fuel, burned flesh, hung low over the river like fog. Shells fell every few minutes, shaking the ground. Every time one landed, dust and plaster rained down from the ceilings of the few buildings still standing. In what used to be a hotel lobby, medics worked by flashlight. The wounded lay shoulder to shoulder, some unconscious, some begging for water. One man had both legs gone and still whispered, "Are the tanks coming?" Another sang quietly to himself, the same hymn over and over until his voice faded. Colonel Frost, pale and bleeding from his leg, moved through the rooms with a pistol in one hand and his radio pressed to his ear. Only static. He tapped the casing, cursed softly, then switched it off. "We hold," he said simply. "That's all we can do." Outside, the Germans came again. Flamethrowers first, bright orange tongues licking across the pavement. Then tanks, pushing up the road, firing point-blank into shattered buildings. The British waited until the armor was almost on top of them before firing their last PIT rounds. One tank erupted into a bloom of flame. Another kept coming, its tracks grinding over the rubble, guns barking like thunder. A private, crouched behind a window frame, counted his last 3 bullets. He used one to drop a German officer, another to wound the man behind him, and then just sat there, staring at the third. When the rifle jammed, he threw it aside and picked up a brick. By the 22nd, Frost was unconscious, carried into the basement by 2 men who could barely walk themselves. Command passed to a captain who hadn't slept in 4 days. "We're finished," someone said. "No," the captain answered. "We're just late." The radio finally caught a voice, faint, distant, crackling through static. "Hold on, reinforcements." But the words were swallowed by the roar of artillery. In London, commanders still spoke of a bridgehead across the Rhine. In Arnhem, the bridge itself was coming apart. Fire had eaten through the girders. Cars burned on the deck. The river below ran black with oil and bodies. On the morning of the 23rd, German loudspeakers called out in English, "Your officers are dead. Lay down your arms, and you will be treated well." A single British voice shouted back, "Go to hell." Then silence, followed by another barrage. By the 4th day, it was no longer a battle. It was survival. Men crawled through basements, searching for rainwater dripping from broken pipes. Ammunition was down to handfuls. When they ran out, they fought with bayonets, knives, even chair legs. One paratrooper, bleeding from the head, looked out the window at the burning bridge and said, "We did our part. Let history sort the rest." At dusk, white flags appeared, not of surrender, but desperation. Civilians tried to evacuate the wounded, waving sheets from windows. German medics moved in cautiously, shouting for ceasefire. Some British soldiers fired anyway. Others simply slumped against walls and let their weapons fall. Frost's men had held 4 days against 9,000 Germans. Now, the bridge that was supposed to lead the Allies into Germany belonged once again to the Reich. That night, the survivors were rounded up in the square, maybe 400 of them, barely standing. One German officer walked among them, studying their faces. "You fought well," he said in halting English. "Too well." In the outskirts of the city, what was left of the 1st Airborne tried to break south toward the river. They crossed fields under moonlight, carrying their wounded on doors and stretchers made of blankets. Mortars followed them every step. Some reached the water, cold, dark, rising fast, and tried to swim. Others slipped beneath the current without a sound. By dawn, only 2,000 of the 10,000 who had landed made it across the Rhine alive. The rest were dead, captured, or missing. When the order finally came through, Operation Market Garden terminated. It sounded clinical, almost polite. But for the men who had fought at Arnhem, it meant the end of everything they had believed the war could be. The bridge still stood, blackened and smoking. Around it, the city was quiet at last. It wasn't defeat by numbers. It was defeat by arrogance. Operation Market Garden was meant to end the war. Instead, it showed how far the war still had to go. When the shooting stopped, it wasn't victory. It was silence, the kind that makes you realize what's gone. Arnhem, September 26, 1944. The air still smelled of cordite and wet ashes. The city that had been full of shouting, gunfire, and burning steel just days before now lay in a stunned, echoing quiet. Roofs were gone. Streets were nothing but trenches of brick and glass. Smoke drifted over the river, soft as a shroud. The Germans moved carefully through the ruins, helmets low, rifles raised. Every shadow looked like it might still shoot back. They expected resistance, but found only the dead and the dying. In the basements beneath shattered houses, British wounded whispered among themselves. Their uniforms were black with soot, bandages brown with blood. They waited for evacuation that would never come. Above them, boots crunched on broken glass. One soldier muttered, "If we stay quiet, maybe they'll think we're ghosts." In one basement, a Dutch family hid 3 paratroopers. The father, a thin man with tired eyes, fed them scraps of bread and potatoes boiled in rainwater. "We gave them what little we had left," his daughter recalled years later, "and prayed the Germans wouldn't find them." But the Germans were thorough. They searched house by house, yard by yard, dragging out survivors. A few soldiers, delirious with fever or pain, still tried to fight. One was shot in his doorway, clutching an empty rifle. By noon, the gunfire had faded completely. Arnhem had fallen, not in a blaze of battle, but in exhaustion. A German officer, young and pale, walked through the wreckage, dictating notes to a sergeant. His voice was flat, detached. "They fought like lions," he said. "It was not a battle, it was a tragedy." In Brussels, at Allied headquarters, the mood was just as heavy. Maps that had once been marked with red arrows of progress now lay untouched. The phones were silent. Report after report came in: bridge lost, division decimated, casualties unknown. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, a staff officer said quietly, "The operation is over." Another added, "No, the dream is." Back in Arnhem, the people tried to make sense of what was left. Dutch civilians picked their way through the rubble, searching for relatives, for food, for anything still alive. The Germans forced many to evacuate their homes. Those who stayed behind faced starvation through the bitter winter that followed, the hunger winter. In an old churchyard, a group of townspeople buried both British and German dead in the same trench. No words, just the scrape of shovels and wet earth. One woman, her hands shaking, placed a piece of bread on top of a British helmet before the dirt covered it. Across the Rhine, the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division gathered in silence. Barely 2,000 of the original 10,000 had made it back. They were filthy, exhausted, hollow-eyed. Some wept. Most didn't have the strength. "We came for a bridge," one man whispered, "and left with ghosts." That night, rain returned. It fell softly over the river, over the ruins, over the bodies that still lay where they had fallen. A few German soldiers worked through the dark, pulling corpses from collapsed buildings, stacking rifles in neat piles beside the road. Others simply stared at the burning skyline. In a small Dutch farmhouse on the outskirts of the city, a nurse tore up bedsheets for bandages. She treated whoever was brought to her, friend or foe, until her hands shook too badly to hold the scissors. "We thought it was over," she wrote later. But the silence was worse than the shelling. It was the sound of everything ending. In the days that followed, propaganda broadcasts claimed victory. German papers called Arnhem a triumph of discipline over chaos. British radio barely mentioned it. London needed hope, not heartbreak. But among the survivors, no one spoke of defeat. They had held longer than anyone believed possible. They had fought without food, without ammunition, without orders, and still refused to surrender until nothing remained. Even in captivity, their defiance lingered. Prisoners in camps whispered to each other through walls. "We were at Arnhem." It wasn't shame. It was pride, the kind born from knowing you gave everything you had. In the Netherlands, stories began to spread, of families who hid soldiers, of Dutch women who risked their lives to smuggle medicine, of children who scavenged for bread to feed the wounded. The battle was over, but the spirit it ignited refused to die. As one German officer wrote in his final report, "They have lost their bridge, but not their honor." And in that silence, that deep, echoing quiet after the guns, the men of Arnhem refused to call it failure. The plan was sound, except for the parts that weren't. That's how the British report began. Cold words for something that had cost 17,000 lives. It was October 1944. The The war raged on, but in Allied headquarters the mood had curdled from triumph to quiet disbelief. Market Garden, the grand gamble that was supposed to open the road into Germany, lay dissected on long tables under harsh lamps. Maps, charts, and coded signals filled the room. Every red arrow now looked like a scar. Officers circled the table, some with coffee gone cold in their hands. They spoke in measured tones, but the air was sharp with blame. It wasn't the plan, one said. It was the execution, said another. A voice from the back murmured, it was arrogance. Field Marshal Montgomery stood at the head of the room, face expressionless. The concept was bold, he said. Boldness is not a crime. His aides shuffled papers, casualty lists, radio logs, intercepted German dispatches. The truth was right there in ink. 2 SS Panzer divisions, the Hohenstaufen and the Frundsberg, had been resting near Arnhem. Intelligence had reported their presence weeks before. No one had listened. In one margin, an American officer had scribbled, "We wanted to believe the war could be won with one more push." General Eisenhower sat silently, smoking. When someone asked who would take responsibility, he exhaled, looked at the map, and said only, "We all will." The meeting dragged for hours. Each failure was turned over like a stone revealing rot beneath. The radios, too weak to penetrate the Dutch terrain. The weather, too unpredictable for resupply drops. The armored column, forced to advance on a single road that became a shooting gallery. And above all, time, lost day by day while men died holding a bridge no one could reach. One logistics officer tried to lighten the air. "It's only a setback," he said. No one laughed. A colonel from the airborne staff stood to speak. His voice trembled, but not from fear. "Those men did everything we asked," he said. "We sent them into the lion's mouth and told them to roar. They did. And we left them there." Outside, autumn rain lashed the windows. The war pressed on, the Allies advancing inch by inch toward the Rhine again, but the optimism that had filled the summer had vanished. In the corridors, whispers replaced orders. Some blamed Montgomery for overreaching, others the Americans for not pushing fast enough, still others the weather, the terrain, or fate itself. But deep down, most knew the truth. It wasn't any one mistake. It was belief that war could be mastered by design. One intelligence officer later wrote, "We weren't defeated by the Germans. We were defeated by our own certainty. We thought we were smarter than the war." Meanwhile, in occupied Holland, the people were paying the price. The Germans, furious at the Dutch resistance's support for the Allies, cut food and fuel supplies to the north. Winter came early that year. People burned furniture for warmth. Bread lines stretched for miles. By January, tens of thousands were starving. A farmer from Utrecht later recalled, "We had believed liberation was days away. Instead, we watched our children grow thinner with every sunrise." In that same winter, survivors from the 1st Airborne sat in POW camps across Germany, replaying the battle in their minds. They drew maps in the dirt, argued about what might have gone differently, but none could find the answer. "We were there," one wrote later, "and we did what men could do." Back in London, newspapers began printing stories that mixed heroism with silence. Officially, Market Garden was described as a partial success. Unofficially, it was a lesson written in blood. Some officers wanted to forget it. Others refused. Major Brian Urquhart, who had warned before the operation that enemy armor lay hidden near Arnhem, returned to his desk and wrote a simple memo. "Next time, listen." Yet even amid failure, respect began to grow, quietly, stubbornly. The Dutch people started calling the men of Arnhem the angels. They spoke of the paratroopers who refused to give up, of the pilots who flew through flak to drop supplies, of the engineers who built bridges under fire only to watch them burn again. In early 1945, a British war correspondent visited the ruins of Arnhem. The bridge was still standing, half blackened, its steel twisted like bone. He wrote in his notebook, "It was a beautiful plan. But plans are only as strong as the men who must die for them. And those men, they were stronger than the plan ever deserved." When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they did it the hard way. No airborne gambles, no sweeping thrusts. They fought town to town, river by river. Behind them lay the ghosts of Market Garden, whispering warnings no one would ever again ignore. In the end, The bridge at Arnhem had not been a path to victory, but a mirror, showing the cost of pride, the fragility of hope, and the thin line between genius and disaster. As one British officer wrote in his diary before shipping home, it wasn't just a military loss. It was a lesson that courage and cleverness are not the same thing. And yet, from the ashes of Arnhem, something unexpected began to grow. Respect. Between soldiers who had fought it and those who had survived it. Between the British and the Dutch, bound not by success, but by sacrifice. They would never call it a triumph. But they would never call it a waste, either. Years later, when the noise of war had faded into memory, an old Dutch woman stood by the riverbank in Arnhem. The wind was cold, the water calm, and she carried a small bundle of flowers. She placed them gently beside the bridge, whispering, "For the boys who came too soon." The bridge above her was not the same one that had burned in 1944. This one was rebuilt, stronger, broader, gleaming in the morning light. But it still held ghosts. To the locals, it was never just a bridge. It was a promise and a wound. Every September, people came, old soldiers in berets and medals, young children carrying flags, widows who still remembered faces from photographs. They stood in silence as the church bells of Arnhem rang 13 times, once for every 1,000 who had fallen. The sound drifted over the river like a prayer that never ended. Among them, a man with a cane and a weathered uniform looked out over the water. He had been a private then, 19 years old, trapped under that same bridge. Now his hair was white, his hands trembling. "We didn't lose Arnhem," he said softly to a reporter. "We just ran out of time." The reporter asked if he ever regretted it. The old soldier smiled faintly. "No," he said. "You don't regret standing your ground. You regret leaving your friends behind." His voice broke when he said it. Around him, Dutch families listened in silence. Many owed their freedom to men like him, men who had fallen in fields and canals far from home. Children clutched small wooden crosses, each bearing a name. Some were too young to understand, but their parents whispered the story anyway. In schools across the Netherlands, teachers told that story every year, not as a tale of defeat, but of courage. The students learned that the failure at Arnhem delayed liberation, but also inspired the resistance to fight harder. They learned how civilians risked their lives to shelter British soldiers, how farmers hid them in barns, and how, even in the face of starvation, the Dutch never forgot the men who had come for them. A museum now stood near the river. Inside were fragments of helmets, burned letters, a torn map with coffee stains. In one corner, a dimly lit display showed a single water bottle with 3 names scratched onto its side: Frost, Jackson, Miller. Next to it, a note written in pencil: "Hold until relieved." The ink had faded, but the words still seemed alive. Visitors moved quietly through the exhibits, reading accounts of those 9 terrible days in September. The story never ended the same way for everyone. Some saw heroism, others saw futility, but all left with a kind of reverence, the understanding that bravery is not measured by outcome. In 1977, the bridge was officially renamed the John Frost Bridge. The surviving colonel attended the ceremony, standing tall despite the years. He looked out over the water and said only, "We came to cross the Rhine. In the end, it crossed us." The crowd applauded, but many wept. The figures were staggering. More than 17,000 Allied casualties, nearly 8,000 German. Towns razed, families scattered, months of hunger and fear. Yet from those ruins came something unbreakable, a bond that outlived war. For decades, veterans from Britain, Poland, and America returned to Arnhem every autumn. They stood side by side with Dutch villagers who had once hidden them from German patrols. They shared bread and beer, told stories that began with laughter and ended in quiet tears. One year, a Polish paratrooper embraced a Dutch farmer who had saved him as a boy. Neither could speak the other's language. They didn't need to. One night, long after the ceremony ended, a few of them stayed by the river. The lights of the bridge shimmered on the surface like embers that refused to die. "You know," one of them said, "we used to think that bridge was the end of the world." Another nodded. It was. And somehow, the world went on. They fell silent, listening to the current. Somewhere upstream, a church bell rang once, then again, echoing through the mist. In the decades that followed, The phrase, "a bridge too far," entered the language, not as mockery, but as a warning, a reminder of the fine line between courage and overreach. Yet to those who had been there, it meant something else entirely. It meant sacrifice beyond reason. It meant faith in one another when logic said all was lost. War historians still debate Market Garden, the strategy, the politics, the numbers. But none of that mattered to the men who fought it. They remembered the sound of the river at night, the smell of smoke, the way their hands shook when they lit a cigarette after the shelling stopped. They remembered faces, not orders. One surviving Dutch nurse, interviewed in the 1980s, said quietly, "When they came, we saw boys. When they left, we saw heroes. And when they died, they became part of us." In the evenings, the people of Arnhem still walk to the bridge when the sun goes down. They stand on the riverbank where so many fell and listen to the wind rushing through the steel beams. It sounds almost like applause, distant, endless. They leave flowers. Always flowers. Roses, tulips, wild daisies from nearby fields. Some float them into the river and watch the petals drift toward the sea, as if carrying messages to the ones who never came home. History remembers the bridges won by fire and steel. But this one, this bridge of ghosts and courage, taught another truth. That even in failure, bravery leaves a mark deeper than victory ever could. They called it a bridge too far. But for those who crossed it, it was far enough to touch eternity.